because the evidence didn't show. They said it was. Now, one very strange fact in all of that is that I knew that they had the brain damage study from Olney's lab that their own people had done. And we talked about the various pieces of evidence that were problems. And I finally said, what about the brain damage problem from the animals in Dr. Olney's laboratory that your own people have gone and looked at? And he said, we don't think those are going to be a problem. Well, it turned out they weren't a problem because they didn't give them to the FDA. So here they had in their own files a study that raised very serious questions, which they did not give to the FDA. That's a violation of law.
G.D. Searle did not inform the FDA of this study until after aspartame's approval. This approval came despite the fact that FDA scientists found serious deficiencies in all tests related to genetic damage.
And so all these concerns were all rolling around inside FDA, and they were trying to organize them into a policy. And every time they would organize them into a policy at the bench and science level, and they would go up one level to where the policy people were, the policy people would overrule them.
A month later, Olney and Turner filed a formal objection stating that they believed aspartame could cause brain damage.
But anyway, we filed our petition. Dr. Olney filed one and I filed one attacking the approval. And the FDA said, right, there are some factual information we should look into. We'll have a public hearing.
Only because some of the investigators working for the Food and Drug Administration, looking at this data, knew that the data did not contain adequate safety information about aspartame.
In 1975, due to serious questions over the quality and validity of G.D. Searle's testing of aspartame and other pharmaceuticals, the FDA formed a special task force to examine 11 of the pivotal studies on aspartame. Pivotal studies are those upon which the FDA bases approval or disapproval. Of the 113 studies done on aspartame submitted to the FDA by Searle, 90 were conducted in the early to mid-1970s. Every test the FDA called pivotal was part of this 90. In March of 1976, the FDA completed their 500-page report after finishing their investigation.
The report by the FDA team that inspected it is the most devastating report about research that has probably ever been written about a specific company. And that led to a series of hearings in Congress and came up with a $12 million appropriation to FDA to enforce good laboratory practices. But what happened is there's a policy resolution, but NutraSweet and Searle got bypassed in the sense that they took this all over here and said, look at this terrible thing that's going on. There were a couple others that were going on at the same time. We've got to do something, and they did something. What they did was going forward, you have to meet these requirements. They didn't do anything about going backwards and saying, look, the stuff you came through here is killing people. Now, the reason they didn't do that at the time, because it happened in 75 and 76, is that it was the assumption of everyone in the process that the FDA was going to handle it. So FDA, one of the things FDA did that was so striking and remarkable is that they, knowing that they had this terrible situation on their hands, hired a group of pathologists. It's a pathology research group. FDA hired them to review the Searle studies, but had Searle pay for it. So the result was, here's a company which makes its money by being hired and paid for to do studies. Well, why would it do a study that was going to be critical of NutraSweet?
In 1977, the FDA Chief Counsel, Richard Merrill, recommended to U.S. Attorney Samuel Skinner that a grand jury be set up to investigate G.D. Searle.
Well, FDA did attempt to do something, and it wasn't the political part of the FDA. These were the people that really were trying to work and do well. One of the counsels, lawyers for the Food and Drug Administration, contacted the U.S. Attorney in Chicago and to bring an indictment against G.D. Searle for fraud, for deletion of records, manipulation of records, falsification of records, and a number of other things on the testing that they did on aspartame and several other products as well.
Suddenly, U.S. Attorney Samuel Skinner began preliminary employment discussions with G.D. Searle's law firm, Sidley & Austin. The U.S. Justice Department urged Attorney Samuel Skinner to proceed with the grand jury, pointing out that the statute of limitations on prosecution would soon run out. Samuel Skinner withdrew from the G.D. Searle case, and Assistant U.S. Attorney William Conlin was assigned to the grand jury investigation. Shortly afterwards, Samuel Skinner left his job to work for G.D. Searle's law firm. The assistant he left behind let the statute of limitations run out on the aspartame charges. This assistant, William Conlin, was hired 15 months later by G.D. Searle's law firm, Sidley and Austin.
The common denominator for all of this, unfortunately, is money. And the amount of money that was flashed around induced people to drop the lawsuit against G.D. Searle and come work for the very firm that they were going to try for illegal activity. And that's what happened with the U.S. Attorney. That's what happened with several people working for the Food and Drug Administration at that time. If they passed aspartame, literally, they were promised great jobs when they finished with FDA.
And it was interesting, the main guy that made the decisions that overruled them in the Bureau of Foods went on to work for the Soft Drink Association. And actually 7 of the key people that made decisions that kept NutraSweet moving through the process ended up working for one or another NutraSweet using industry. That's kind of an interesting side effect to the whole thing.
I like to do well at things. It's important to me that if you're given an assignment that you try to do it the best you can. I'm afraid that some people confuse that with some sort of single-mindedness on my part.
Donald Rumsfeld went into the company after he left Washington, after Ford lost, and that would be in 1977. Is in business, and he was the congressman from there. And then he went to the White House, where he was White House Chief of Staff, and then he became the Secretary of Defense. And he's involved in a whole group of people around Chicago that are, they're involved in a whole range of things, national security being one of them. He was also part of the RAND Corporation, one of the major defense think tanks. He's a very bright guy, like in the best and the brightest, the kind of people that brought us Vietnam. These are people who believe that thinking is the primary way that you get through life. Having values, feelings, and so forth, they denigrate. So he took over this company, and it was going down the tubes completely. It had FDA investigations. It had grand jury investigations. It was losing money. Its stock was down. A person was hired to come in and explain why the FDA was so down on them, and went through all of their records and said, "You guys haven't got a chance. This company is a mess, a total mess." And he went in with a full team of politicians. He went in with himself, a politician. He brought his special assistant, who was a Republican Party operative, worked with the Republican National Committee, brought in a press guy from there, brought in lawyers, and they took on the issue of this company as a political issue. And one of the first things that not first, but somewhere in that first year, it was late in the year, he called me and said, "Let's have a meeting." So I went and I met with him. We flew into the Madison Hotel and we met and we talked. And my point was that the struggle that was going on around NutraSweet was a scientific struggle. We needed to know the scientific answers. And this was before the Public Court of Inquiry had ruled. We needed to know the answers. So why don't we, the people who were raising all of the questions about NutraSweet and the company, together create a set of protocols that we would agree address the serious questions that needed to be looked at to decide whether or not it should be marketed. So we had this meeting. And for about 6 months, his staff and I and our group negotiated out how we could proceed on this. His own scientists didn't want to do it. For example, at the time that they put their evidence into FDA in 1973, there were no requirements at FDA to examine effects on the brain from food additives. No requirements whatsoever. So there never was a study done to look at whether or not this affected the brain in a neurological sense. The cancer studies were incidental. Those were cancer studies. But these were not brain studies. The cancer studies turned up brain tumors. But they didn't look, for example, at these holes in the brain or mental retardation or lowering the ability of people to think or causing dizziness or blindness or any of those things. None of that was looked at. And we were proposing that we design some studies to look at it. And that was the direction I thought we should go. And I should say that at that point, I was involved with a group of people from the food industry. We had created something called the Food Safety Council. We had 35 major corporations, and it had a board that was half corporate people and half consumer advocates, academic people, environmentalists, and so forth, to look at the standards for food safety. And we had written a whole series of standards for food safety. Basically, what I was saying to Rumsfeld is, why don't you bring your company into the same framework that all these other companies have agreed to be a part of? And we had a very good, very full and frank exchange. His scientists kept jumping up and running around the room and saying, there's no problem, there's no problem, there's no problem. Ultimately, he made the decision not to find out what the facts were, but to move forward on the limited record that they had before them. And I believe it was a decision that was made that said we can accomplish our ends better legally and politically than we can by actually doing the science to determine the outcome of the questions that are being asked. And in my mind, that demonstrated that he was an individual not interested in facts, not interested in the truth, not interested in finding out what the fundamental realities are, but much, much more interested in setting a goal and then by will and force pulling all the resources that he could possibly pull together to achieve that goal, i.e. get NutraSweet on the market and sold.
And so Donald Rumsfeld had been in all these meetings and known all of these potentially very harmful effects of this substance that he then went on and continued to market.
Well, I can't say what Donald Rumsfeld knew or didn't know. He's not a scientist. He's not very interested in science, from what I can tell. More or less, he's a fixer. He's an operative. You assign him a job and he goes and he does it. Now, I'm sure that as he gets up into the level of Defense Department, he sort of makes up his own jobs and says, I'm going to do these things. But facts are not all that important to how he proceeds, because he's so confident that he knows what the outcome should be, that he will look across, at least in the way he did on NutraSweet, he looked across the horizon to find all those facts that would support his position, and then minimized or denigrated all the facts that didn't support his position.
In 1980, the Public Board of Inquiry voted unanimously to reject the use of aspartame until additional studies could be done on aspartame's potential to cause brain tumors.
The product was said not to be, it was ruled by law, it was said you cannot market this product. And then they had to go and do political triage and get in there and manipulate the process. So, I mean, the manipulation was so powerful that one of the first things that Ronald Reagan did when he became president was suspend the authority of the FDA commissioner to take any actions. So he was sworn in whatever day in January, and the next day he issued an executive order eliminating the FDA commissioner's authority to take actions. There was obviously a fear on the part of somebody that the commissioner was going to do something about NutraSweet or something else that would create difficulty, because it took him a while to get a new commissioner. It took him a little over a month to get a new commissioner, get the old one out and the new one in. And in that month, the old commissioner was prevented from taking any actions by an executive order. And that takes a high level of political clout to do that. But that's political triage on a situation that had gone sour because Rumsfeld had made the decision to just power his way through and ignore getting the facts.
In 1981, the day after Ronald Reagan took office as U.S. President, G.D. Searle reapplied for the approval of aspartame. Several new studies were submitted along with their application. 3 of the 5 FDA scientists responsible for reviewing brain tumor issues advised against the approval of aspartame. Under the watch of the new FDA commissioner, Arthur Hull Hayes, the panel lawyer assigned a new panel member to eventually achieve a 3-to-3 split over aspartame. On July 18, 1981, Arthur Hull Hayes overruled the Public Board of Inquiry to approve aspartame for use in dry foods.
Furthermore, the FDA impaneled its own panel to review the Public Board of Inquiry. 3 of those people were assigned, review the cancer part of the Public Board of Inquiry, the part that said you can't market it. Those 3 scientists, every single one of them said, we agree with the Public Board of Inquiry. These are 3 FDA senior scientists. We agree with the Public Board of Inquiry. They met with the commissioner the night before he announced that he was going to approve NutraSweet and begged him not to approve NutraSweet.
Animals just ordinarily do not get brain tumors. And this should have been enough to have invoked the so-called Delaney Amendment to the 1958 Food and Drug Act, which says that if something causes tumors or cancer in experimental animals, you should not approve it for human use.
In 1983, the FDA approved the use of aspartame in carbonated beverages. Under charges of improprieties, Arthur Hull Hayes left the FDA and was hired as a consultant for $1,000 a day by G.D. Searle's public relations firm.
NutraSweet, or aspartame, is the most studied food ingredient ever approved by the FDA, and not just by the FDA, but by more than 70 regulatory bodies around the world.
In order to rubber stamp it around the world, you've got to get it approved in another country. Okay, so let's take Europe. If England were to find out that they wanted them indicted for fraud, if they ever read these reports by the CDC or the FDA Board of Inquiry saying it's not safe, or found out, about that they wanted them indicted, naturally they're not going to approve it. So what they did was, Searle, the manufacturer, made a business deal with the Professor Paul Turner, who was in the regulatory agency in England, and he approved it without anybody knowing it. Parliament had a big blowout about it, and the story was in The Guardian. I have a copy of it, but they did not rescind the order. There were no studies done in the UK, and it was rubber stamped. Then, around the world, they could say, well, it was approved in the United States, it was approved in Europe, and then it was approved, in other places. They tried to get it approved in Canada, and they couldn't do it. But once they got it approved in Europe, they began to rubber stamp it around the world.
The American Dietetic Association, the American Diabetes Association, the American Medical Association, goes all the way down the line. And if you were to see and read their journals and publications and see who the sponsors were and the people who were paying a great deal for advertising therein, it would make a little bit more sense.
But the Center for Disease Control did an investigation and said it was safe.
No, the Center for Disease never said it was safe either. What they did, here is the Center for Disease Control investigation. And it's a 146-page document. What it goes into, what was happening to the people, goes into cardiac arrest, it goes into seizures, it goes into liver problems, it goes into mood alteration, and it goes into death. And it ends up by saying that more neurological studies need to be done. Now here's what happened. If you go to the Center for Disease Control website, you will see a summary, not this 146-page investigation, but a summary that contradicts this report, saying that it was just mild findings. And I told Dr. Satcher before he left the CDC and became Surgeon General, I said, if you don't take that phony summary off, I will put the whole 146-page investigation on web and let the world see what the Center for Disease Control did. And we do have it on www.dorway.com, like doorway with one O. You can read this entire investigation, and this is the original document.
Betty Martini and her organization, Mission Possible, have served as the lighthouse for people who suspect their toxin to be aspartame and wish to learn more. For over 10 years, she has worked tirelessly to inform people of this issue, often challenged by the pharmaceutical and food industries. Mission Possible is the central hub for prevailing knowledge of aspartame. Betty Martini and Mission Possible contribute to Doorway.com, a website that is likely the most frequently cited internet source on this issue. A substantial find in my investigation was Betty Martini. Her work is an act of charity, and her sources are credible.
And of course, as the case histories came in on the internet, and they were just coming in so fast that one day I got 12,000 case histories of people suffering from aspartame and crashed my computer. So 4 support groups have been set up on the internet to take care of these people, because finally they wondered, they'd been going from doctor to doctor, they read that, and they realized why they had MS, they realized about lupus, they realized about diabetes. Many of them called just hysterical, crying, could this be true, could this be true? But as they got off, their MS symptoms disappeared. People that were blind could see again.
Now the current philosophy within the Food and Drug Administration is, let's go ahead and we'll approve this food additive or whatever is in here, and we'll let the people prove that it's dangerous.
They were calling the FDA, they were calling the hospitals, the doctors, they were calling the CDC. I got one email from the CDC, and they said, people are calling over here, they're hysterical about this. I said, well, whose fault is it? You did the most damning investigation ever done. I said, and then you put this phony summary up there instead of, you should be doing what I'm doing. You are the Center for Disease Control, and we're having to alert the world, because you people sold out.
And then you get up with this very terrible equation that says, well, if this thing only harms 1 in a million people, we'll consider it to be safe. Now, harms, they say kills. If it kills only 1 in a million people, the FDA considers it to be safe. So what you have then, by virtue of that, is you're saying that as far as we're concerned, something that kills between 200 and 300 people a year, we consider safe. That doesn't work for the 200 or 300 people. And so if you're going to do that, you better have a label somewhere that says safe means will kill no more than 200 or 300 people a year.
And I want to pose that to people, because I've had a conversation with some other federal regulators, and I said, with all the technology we have today, with all the advances in medicine and science, people are getting sicker. Has anyone noticed that? People are buying more pharmaceutical drugs to cure the very things that these chemical companies started to begin with. So I'm thinking, from the womb to the tomb, you're going to be paying money to these pharmaceutical companies, and they're going to be manipulating the politics so you get to consume all of their poisons, all of the toxins, things that are totally untested. And we're going to see 5 or 6 years from now people coming down with new kinds of diseases, things that we've never even heard of today.
You have to take some responsibility for what you're putting in your mouth. But in this case, they have no way of knowing. You got the FDA lying to them. They got the CDC, the professional organizations. They go to the doctors. The doctors can't help them because they've been lied to too.
Doctors only know what they're taught, and they only believe what they're allowed to believe. So I think it was the year 1917, but I could be wrong. Somewhere in that era, they developed the electrocardiogram. The year before, indigestion was the #1 cause of death in the United States. The year after the electrocardiogram was invented, myocardial infarction was the #1 cause of death in the United States. So a lot of doctors are still back on the NutraSweet issue. They're still way back in the era before anybody allowed them to know anything wrong with it.
So many of these things are prolonged effects, and of course if a physician sees it and they see a child with a seizure, they're not going to connect it to the MSG or aspartame because they don't know about this research. They're not familiar with it. They'll just tell the mother, well, I don't see how that could be related, something you drank when you were pregnant.
We're about ready to meet Diane Fleming, who was convicted of murdering her husband by methanol poisoning. Her attorney neglected to mention that her husband was a big consumer of aspartame products, and aspartame breaks down into methanol and could have been the cause of his death rather than her. That's a possibility that was never brought out in court, and therefore she got 50 years in this prison. We're about ready to meet her and hear her side of the story, so stay tuned. Describe your husband to me. Tell me what he was like.
Well, he kept to himself a lot. I don't think a lot of people knew him real well. You know, he didn't want to socialize with people at work or anything. He was very driven at work. Like, he never missed work, even the morning in question when he got up sick. And he's saying, oh, I feel terrible. But he went to work because that's what he did. We had a weight machine. We had stair climber. We had treadmill. And he read everything he could find about how to, the right way to do weights, and, you know, like you do sets instead of just doing it. You know, you do so many repetitions and stop for a minute and then do it again like 3 times, something like that. He was pretty much obsessed with building his body. He didn't want to be fat like his relatives. He'd started reading about creatine and said that he wanted to try it, and he talked about it for a while beforehand. And apparently what it does is it pulls the muscle, pulls water to the muscles to pump them up more.
I was wondering exactly what it was.
Yeah, that, you know, that doesn't sound like a good idea, messing with the fluid balances in your body, pulling water from one place, you know, putting it someplace else. But, and I think it had something to do with the recovery time, and he wanted to try that. And but we picked up some Gatorade. He was trying to decide what to put it in, because you could mix it in, they said water or fruit juice, but water probably wouldn't taste too good, and he didn't drink fruit juice. So he said, well, maybe Gatorade. He thought he could tolerate that. So we got the 20-ounce bottles, like a case. I guess it was 24. It was assorted flavors. You know, he kind of tasted it, see how it tasted, and then set it in the fridge. And went to the pool with our daughter and came back. Well, then he played basketball from about 4 until 7 with the guys, mostly some guys from church. And they would meet at the middle school. And came back and drank that. Even when he came back from playing ball, he wasn't feeling good, but it was very hot. That month, that summer, it got hot early. Even in May and early June, it was really hot. It, you know, and he always felt lousy. I'm short of breath, I can't breathe. He was like, lay down, get up. You know, he said he couldn't breathe. So I kept saying, well, do you want me to, you know, what, you know, do you want me to call the doctor again? Do you want me to take you to the hospital? What do you want me to do? And this went on for about a half an hour, I guess. And finally he said, okay, you can call the ambulance. Because he, I guess, finally started
Feeling that bad.
Feeling bad enough, because you know how men are. They won't go for anything. So called the ambulance, and he was showing some signs of maybe being a little bit disoriented, but he was still talking and everything, and answering the questions. The paramedics thought, kind of what I did, that he was dehydrated from throwing up so much, and that his electrolytes might have been out of whack, because they said, well, we need to get some fluid in you and get some electrolytes. And his breathing was real fast. They, you know, tried to get him to slow his respirations down. They said he was hyperventilating, and they thought that was a lot of his problem. And they put him in the ambulance and, you know, transported him. And about, after we'd gotten out of our neighborhood and into and through the other neighborhood, we were still kind of going on back roads, they turned the lights on, and that kind of scared me when they, because there wasn't traffic. It was, so we were crossing over the lake. They turned the lights on. But I called his parents in after I'd done all the paperwork. You know, they took him on back, but I had to give them the insurance information and everything. They eventually called me back there, and he was still conscious, but he was way incoherent. You know, he wasn't making any sense, and he was real, like, wanting to get up off the gurney and everything, and they finally had to give him some Ativan IV to calm him down, because he wouldn't stay, you know.
And what's that?
Ativan is, it's in the same family as Valium. wound up putting him then in the MICU, medical intensive care unit. By the time he got up there, he wasn't really conscious anymore, but then they had pumped him full of Ativan too, so it's hard to say. You know, I don't know at what point. Really? I'm not on Zoloft anymore, so I don't know at what point he really went into a coma, you know, and when it was the Ativan. I know that night I mentioned to him that he wore the extended wear lenses, and even though you sleep in those things, you know, the nurses don't usually like for patients to have them in. I know they make you take them out. Usually that's one of the things they ask you, and I brought it up, so they said, well, would you take his lenses out? You know, and he kind of responded to that, you know, like whenever I was trying to remove his lenses, which is really hard to do on another person. During the course of it, you know, when we were going over, you know, trying to, you know, figure out everything, I told him that he had been complaining of shortness of breath for a few weeks. About in early May, he started complaining of shortness of breath. And the first week or two of May, he had a stress echo. I finally got him to go to our doctor, and he ordered a stress echo. And early the next morning, the doctor called and said that they'd already gotten the toxicology back, which they weren't expecting that for a long time. They said it would take, you know, a couple of days, which sounds kind of bad. And they said they'd gotten it back and they found methanol in his system. Apparently, your body doesn't metabolize methanol. This is what they were telling me, and then I read up on it. As soon as they told me that's what it was, I started reading up on it too on the internet. Your body can't metabolize methanol like it does ethanol. When it tries to, it breaks down into formaldehyde and maybe some other things, but the formaldehyde is what is really bad. So what they do is to try to, the same enzyme that in your body that works on the methanol is the same enzyme that breaks down ethanol, the kind of alcohol that you drink. So the treatment is to infuse ethanol intravenously, and then your body, instead of working on the methanol, it kind of leaves it alone and works on the ethanol. That gives them time to try to use dialysis and stuff to get the methanol out of your system. Well, they kept saying they weren't able to get his blood alcohol level up enough. And even though they were taking into consideration that he was a drinker, you know, apparently drinkers, you know, you can handle more alcohol. Your body works with it better. So they, you know, gave him more than what they would have a non-drinker, but they said they didn't feel like they were able to get his blood alcohol level up enough. So they were doing the dialysis. I think they started him on that the very next day, I believe, the second day. They started him on the dialysis. But, you know, he just wasn't responding at all. He just, you know, like I said, then they decided he was in a coma at some point, I guess, because after the Ativan wore off and he still was unresponsive. They did a CAT scan and said that he had suffered a major brain bleed. A brain bleed, and the size and location was such that they said no one could survive that, even if they were successful in getting the methanol out of his body, that because of the bleeding in the brain, you know, that wasn't. So they started talking about discontinued life support. And you know, we talked about it. That was on that Wednesday. know, they kept assuring us that there was no way, even if they kept treating the methanol, that because of the brain damage, that there was nothing that could be done. So I wanted to wait until give it another day. Well, I was the one that called the police. That morning, that Wednesday morning, when Dr. Akers, he called me before I got there, you know, it was before 7:30. I was getting Megan ready for school. He said, "We think this may have been a poisoning, an intentional poisoning, and you need to get the police involved." I'm like, how do I do that, you know? So I said, okay, even though that afternoon before, you know, the decision about removing life support, I met the police. They asked me to come back to the house so they could look for possible sources. Specialists have looked at it now, said that the amount of diet drinks that he consumed would easily account for the levels of methanol that he had in his body. I think drinking the creatine just kind of must have pushed it over the edge, you know. Adulteration of a substance and first-degree murder. And the jury gave me 20 years on the adulteration and 30 on the murder, and the judge ran them concurrently.
We're all human, you know, people are human, and people like to believe that 12 people on a jury found her guilty, so she must be guilty. No way, you know. I mean, I have argued that since day one, and I still do not understand what those people could have possibly heard in those testimonies. You read the transcript. What could they have heard that could possibly have convinced them that Diane Fleming could have killed her husband?
I included Diane Fleming in my journey because chronic methanol toxicity from aspartame was not considered at all in her case. Instead, they chose to prosecute her for supposedly pouring a sealed bottle of blue windshield wiper fluid into Gatorade to poison her husband. While there is no way that I can definitively state the precise or exact cause of my own condition, I did drink 6 to 10 cans of diet soda per day for 20 years, and when my body told me to stop, I eventually got better. I can also state that I have spoken to healthcare professionals who agree with me that aspartame is a probable culprit. When I first embarked upon this journey, a part of me was expecting to return empty-handed. What I uncovered, however, was that the current measures of food safety are failing us.
So what do we do today?
We drove. and drove and drove. And now we're going to drive some more.
What would you say to the makers and manufacturers of aspartame now, if you could?
I think they owe me a fortune. They owe me an apology. But they owe me a fortune. I live on Social Security disability. I have nothing left. I'm very heavily in debt. I am trying very hard to start my own business, but that in itself takes money that I don't have. So I'm doing it bits and pieces as I can.
But after that, I mean, just each day was just better and better and better. I'm still finding things that it's in because they don't label it very well, and that is very, very aggravating because you have to read each label, and I've got 3 kids and everything, and I don't have a whole lot of time to go spending a year and a half in the grocery store to do a week's worth of groceries, reading every label that I get my hands on.
I've been into chat areas and talked to people with multiple sclerosis, and they're very, very hostile to people like me. So I don't tout it too much.
All the while, I've learned that there is a very safe sweetener that's an alternative to sugar called stevia, S-T-E-V-I-A. To this day, the FDA will not allow stevia to be labeled, advertised, or promoted as a sweetener. It cannot state that. It's just an alternative food supplement.